Hi there, my name is Will and I'm going to walk you through how you can install your Python dependencies inside of Kestra. One of the most frustrating parts of Python development is managing your dependencies. Now there are a number of different ways we can do this in Kestra to try and make the experience smoother. Now the first way we can do it is using the property beforeCommands. Now for both the script and command Python tasks, we have a property here called beforeCommands. Now this just lets you run any commands before your Python code is executed. So any pip installs or virtual environments you will do those here. And so here I am simply doing pip install pandas and Kestra so I can then use those in my flow. So now if I press execute, you'll see here that it's going to run it quite nicely. As you can see here, it's created a Docker image and it's installing those requirements inside of my container. And we'll be able to see that once it's installed, it will then be able to start executing the code. And as we can see, it executed successfully and it produced the value that we were expecting to see. Now, this is very useful, but the annoying thing here, as you saw in the execution logs, is it has to pull a Docker image if you're using the Docker task runner, which by default, the Kestra Python tasks use a Docker task runner. Now, a task runner just specifies the environment that it's going to run in. We could also set it to a process one to run it as a sub-process on our Kestra instance, but we would recommend that you use the Docker one to keep your dependencies isolated. Now, if you are using a virtual environment, beforeCommands is very helpful because here I can simply just set the task runner to process. Now here I've added a virtual environment to the beforeCommands section. So now it's going to create our virtual environment, activate it, and then install the dependencies into it. So when I execute this now, we'll see that it won't be manually pulling a Docker image, which can take extra time. We'll see that it's going to run straight to creating that virtual environment and installing those dependencies. So beforeCommands can work really helpful if you want to install those dependencies inside of a virtual environment on the process task runner. By using a Docker task runner, it removes the need for needing a virtual environment because we have a container that all our dependencies will be isolated in. Now, one of the cool features about the task runners is you can specify the container image that it's going to use. So we can be smart here and pick a container image that has the dependencies that we already need. In this example, I'm specifying that I'm using the Docker task runner. I don't need to because it is the default value, but I'm going to add it here just for clarity. Now underneath, I can set my container image. Now Kestra has a number of container images available on GitHub that allows you to get started with some of those dependencies pre-installed. Let's have a look at those. Here's a number of those for example. For example, here we have one called PyData, and if we click into that, we can see that this one contains a bunch of dependencies that can be quite useful. So here we can see that PyData image has things such as pandas, request, scikit-learn, and so on. And so if you're looking for something that's got some of those all ready to go available in the GitHub registry, then we can just use that. And because we want pandas, this is a perfect fit for us. So what I can do here is I can simply just rename my image to PyData, and now it's going to pull that Docker image and already have the dependencies installed. So I don't have to then use beforeCommands to install them on top of that. This just helps to speed things up a little bit. So now when I press execute, we'll see that it's going to pull that image, but no dependencies are going to be installed, which will just help speed things up, especially if you end up caching the image. And just like that, this ran significantly quicker than when we were running it previously. This only really works though if you have a container image ready to go. Now you may already have a separate CI that's building your code into a Docker image and sending it to a registry that you can then access. That's great and all, but you might not have that, and you might want to use some more generic packages that don't need you to build them in a separate CI. Now we can actually do that directly in Kestra with the Docker build task. Now here, I've got the same example as earlier, but instead, I've got the Docker build task here to create me a Docker image based on a Docker file that I can specify here. This Docker file is very straightforward. We start our Docker file with a Python image. So we've got the base here for what we're after. We want to run Python. So we'll start with the Python 3.10 image, which was probably the default image we were using when we were using beforeCommands. Now with that in mind, we can now run pip install in here to install those dependencies on top of the image, and then it will bundle it all together and make it ready to go for our Docker task runner in our next task. So once this is run and we create a simple tag here called Python image, then we can then simply access that as an expression here in the container image property below, just like this. Now, one thing worth noting is we do set the pull policy to never, because the Docker build task does actually let you push it to a registry. So if you want to build it and then push it to a GitHub registry or maybe Google Cloud, for example, you can do that too and then pull it from that registry. You don't necessarily have to build it in here and then run it. But if you do want to build it in here and not push it to a registry, then you need to set pull policy to never, because we're never pulling it from a registry. We want to be able to just go straight from one task to the next. So you'll see when I execute this, obviously it will take a little bit longer because it's got to build that image, but it builds it pretty quickly with those things pre-installed. And we can see that it goes straight to running our task. And like earlier, we can see that it does in fact have the total at the end, which would show that Pandas was installed and Kestra was installed. So those are just a few ways that you can manage your dependencies in Python with Kestra. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below on how you're going to use Python within Kestra, so we can create more guides like this to help you get the most out of Kestra. Make sure to join our Slack community where you can discuss with us further and give us a star on GitHub.